Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of The Princess and the Goblin with Lord Petty and... Go ahead, Rolfie. It's Rolfie! Sorry, folks, I told Rolfie that he could do that. He's been practicing it all week. Ta-da! All right, we are now on Chapter 8. This chapter is called The Goblins. I think we're gonna finally be able to hear and meet some of these goblins in this chapter. Now, just to refresh your memory, do remember that in the mines where little Curdy works is where also the goblins are. So it's very common that Curdy, along with the other miners, hear the goblins tapping away. So just keep that in mind as we go ahead and read this chapter. Chapter 8, The Goblins. For some time, Curdy worked away briskly, throwing all the ore he had disengaged on one side behind him to be ready for carrying out in the morning. He heard a good deal of goblin tapping, but it all sounded far away in the hill, and he paid it little heed. Toward midnight, he began to feel rather hungry, so he dropped his pickaxe, got a lump of bread, which in the morning he had laid in a damp hole in the rock, sat down on a heap of ore, and ate his supper. Then he leaned back for 5 minutes' rest before beginning his work again, and laid his head against the rock. He had not kept the position for 1 minute before he heard something which made him sharpen his ears. It sounded like a voice inside the rock. After a while, he heard it again. It was a goblin voice. There could be no doubt about that, and this time he could make out the words.
"Hadn't we better be moving?"
it said. A rougher and deeper voice replied.
"There's no hurry. That wretched little mole won't be through tonight, if he work ever so hard. He's by no means at the finished place." "But you still think the load does come through into our house?"
said the first voice.
"Yes, but a good bit farther on than he has got to yet. If he had struck a stroke more to the side, just here,"
said the goblin, tapping the very stone, as it seemed to Curdy, against which his head lay.
"he would have been through, but he's a couple of yards past it now, and if he follow the load, it will be a week before it leads him in. You see it back there, a long way. Still, perhaps in case of accident, it would be as well to be getting out of this. Helfer, you'll take the great chest. That's your business, you know."
"Yes, Dad,"
said a third voice.
"but you must help me to get it on my back. It's awfully heavy, you know."
"Well, it isn't just a bag of smoke, I admit, but you're as strong as a mountain, Helfer."
"You say so, Dad. I think myself I'm all right, but I could carry 10 times as much if it wasn't for my feet."
"That is your weak point, I confess, my boy."
"Ain't it yours too, Father?"
"Well, to be honest, it is a goblin weakness. Why they come so soft, I declare I haven't an idea."
"Especially when your head's so hard, you know, Father."
"Yes, my boy, the goblin's glory is his head. To think how the fellows up above there have to put on helmets and things when they go fighting."
"But why don't we wear shoes like them, Father? I should like it, especially when I've got a chest like that on my head."
"Well, you see, it's not the fashion. The king never wears shoes."
"The Queen does."
Yes, but that's for distinction. The first queen, you see, I mean the king's first wife, wore shoes, of course, because she came from upstairs, and so, when she died, the next queen would not be inferior to her, as she called it, and would wear shoes too. It was all pride. She is the hardest in forbidding them to the rest of the women." "I'm sure I wouldn't wear them. No, not for that, I wouldn't,"
said the first voice, which was evidently that of the mother of the family.
"I can't think why either of them should." "Didn't I tell you the first was from upstairs?"
said the other.
"That was the only silly thing I ever knew His Majesty guilty of. Why should he marry an outlandish woman like that? One of our natural enemies, too." "I suppose he fell in love with her." "Pooh! He's just as happy now with one of his own people."
"Did she die very soon? They didn't tease her to death, did they?"
"Oh dear, no! The king worshipped her very footmarks."
"What made her die then? Didn't the heir agree with her?"
"She died when the young prince was born."
"How silly of her! We never do that. It must have been because she wore shoes."
"I don't know that."
Why do they wear shoes up there?
Ah, now that's a sensible question, and I will answer it. But in order to do so, I must first tell you a secret. I once saw the Queen's feet.
Without her shoes?
Yes, without her shoes.
No. Did you? How was it?
Never you mind how it was. She didn't know I saw him. And what do you think? They had toes.
Toes? What's that?
You may well ask. I should never have known if I had not seen the Queen's feet. Just imagine, the ends of her feet were split up into 5 or 6 thin pieces.
Oh, horrid! How could the king have fallen in love with her?
You forget that she wore shoes. That is just why she wore them. That is why all the men, and women too, upstairs wear shoes. They can't bear the sight of their own feet without them.
Ah, now I understand. If ever you wish for shoes again, Helfer, I'll hit your feet, I will.
No, Mother, pray don't.
Then don't you.
But with such a big box on my head.
A horrid scream followed, which Curdie interpreted as in reply to a blow from his mother upon the feet of her eldest goblin.
Well, I never knew so much before,
remarked a fourth voice.
Your knowledge is not universal quite yet. You were only 50 last month. Mind you, see to the bed and bedding. As soon as we've finished our supper, we'll be up and going.
What are you laughing at, husband?
I'm laughing to think what a mess the miners will find themselves in somewhere before this day 10 years.
What do you mean?
Oh, nothing.
Oh, yes, you do mean something. You always do mean something.
It's more than you do, then, wife.
That may be, but it's not more than I find out, you know.
Ha! You're a sharp one. What a mother you've got, Helfer.
Yes, Father.
Well, I suppose I must tell you. They're at the palace consulting about it tonight, and as soon as we've got away from this thin place, I'm going there to hear what night they fix upon. I should like to see that young ruffian there on the other side, struggling in the avenues of...
He dropped his voice so low that Curdie could hear only a growl. The growl went on in a low bass for a good while, as inarticulate as if the goblin's tongue had been a sausage. And it was not until his wife spoke again that it rose to its former pitch.
But what shall we do when you are at the palace?
I will see you safe in the new house I've been digging for you for the last 2 months. Podge, you mind the table and chairs. I commit them to your care. The table has 7 legs, each chair 3. I shall require them all at your hands.
After this arose a confused conversation about the various household goods and their transport, and Curdie heard nothing more that was of any importance. He now knew at least one of the reasons for the constant sound of the goblin hammers and pickaxes at night. They were making new houses for themselves, to which they might retreat when the miners should threaten to break into their dwellings. But he had learned 2 things of far greater importance. The first was that some grievous calamity was preparing and almost ready to fall upon the heads of the miners. The second was the one weak point of a goblin's body. He had not known that their feet were so tender, and he had now reason to suspect. He had heard it said that they had no toes. He had never had opportunity of inspecting them closely enough in the dusk in which they always appeared to satisfy himself whether it was a correct report. Indeed, he had not been able even to satisfy himself as to whether they had no fingers, although that also was commonly said to be the fact. One of the miners, indeed, who had had more schooling than the rest, was one to argue that such must have been the primordial condition of humanity, and that education and handicraft had developed both toes and fingers, with which proposition Curdie had once heard his father sarcastically agree, alleging in support of it the probability that babies' gloves were a traditional remnant of the old state of things, while the stockings of all ages, no regard being paid in them to the toes, pointed in the same direction. But what was of importance was the fact concerning the softness of the goblin feet, which he foresaw might be useful to all miners. What he had to do in the meantime, however, was to discover, if possible, the special evil design the goblins had now in their heads. Although he knew all the gangs and all the natural galleries with which they communicated in the mined part of the mountain, he had not the least idea where the palace of the king of the gnomes was. Otherwise, he would have set out at once on the enterprise of discovering what the said design was. He judged, and rightly, that it must lie in a farther part of the mountain, between which and the mine there was as yet no communication. There must be one nearly completed, however, for it could be but a thin partition which now separated them. If only he could get through in time to follow the goblins as they retreated. A few blows would doubtless be sufficient, just where his ear now lay, but if he attempted to strike there with his pickaxe, he would only hasten the departure of the family, put them on their guard, and perhaps lose their involuntary guidance. He therefore began to feel the wall with his hands, and soon found that some of the stones were loose enough to be drawn out with little noise. Laying hold of a large one with both his hands, he drew it gently out and let it down softly.
What was that noise?
Said the goblin father. Curdie blew out his light, lest it should shine through.
It must be that one miner who has stayed behind the rest,
said the mother.
No, he's been gone a good while. I haven't heard a blow for an hour. Besides, it wasn't like that.
Then I suppose it must have been a stone carried down the brook inside.
Perhaps. It will have more room by and by.
Curdie kept quite still. After a little while, hearing nothing but the sounds of their preparations for departure, mingled with an occasional word of direction, and anxious to know whether their removal of the stone had made an opening into the goblin's house, he put in his hand to feel. It went in a good way, and then came in contact with something soft. He had but a moment to feel it over, it was so quickly withdrawn. It was one of the toeless goblin feet. The owner of it gave a cry of fright.
Oh!
What's the matter, Helfer?
Asked his mother.
A beast came out of that wall and licked my foot.
Nonsense! There are no wild beasts in our country,
said his father.
But it was, Father! I felt it!
Nonsense, I say! Will you malign your native realms and reduce them to a level with the country upstairs? That is swarming with wild beasts of every description.
But I did feel it, Father!
I tell you to hold your tongue. You are no patriot.
Curdie suppressed his laughter and lay still as a mouse. But no stiller, for every moment he kept nibbling away with his fingers at the edges of the hole. He was slowly making it bigger, for here the rock had been very much shattered with the blasting. There seemed to be a good many in the family, to judge from the mass of confused talk which now and then came through the hole, but when all were speaking together, and just as if they had bottle brushes, each at least one, in their throats, it was not easy to make out which that was said. At length he heard once more what the father goblin was saying.
Now then,
he said,
get your bundles on your backs. Here, Helfer, I'll help you up with your chest.
I wish it was my chest, Father.
Your turn will come in good time enough. Make haste. I must go to the meeting at the palace tonight. When that's over, we can come back and clear out the last of the things before our enemies return in the morning. Now, light your torches and come along. What a distinction it is to provide our own light instead of being dependent on the thing hung up in the air, a most disagreeable contrivance, intended no doubt to blind us when we venture out under its baleful influence. Quite glaring and vulgar, I call it, though no doubt useful to poor creatures who haven't the wit to make light for themselves.
Curdie could hardly keep himself from calling through to know whether they made the fire to light their torches by. But a moment's reflection showed him that they would have said they did, inasmuch as they struck two stones together, and the fire came. All right, Rolfe, what did you think of the first goblins that we got to meet?
They were pretty weird.
Yeah? How so, Rolfe?
Well, it seemed like they were making houses down there and moving all their stuff, and they don't have toes. Who doesn't have toes?
I guess the goblins don't, and apparently little Curdie didn't know that they didn't have toes as well.
Yes, but now Curdie knows that the goblins' weak point are their feet.
Wow, Rolfe, you were really paying attention.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of sucked in now.
Yes, me too, Rolfe. It's getting pretty good. Now, one more thing. What else did Curdie learn about the goblins?
Other than them building houses and they got weak feet?
Yes, other than that.
Oh, They're planning something bad.
Indeed they are, Rolfe. Are you ready to learn what that might be?
Are they building a dragon?
There's only one way to find out, buddy. Let's move on to the next chapter. Chapter 9, titled The Hall of the Goblin Palace. A sound of many soft feet followed, but soon ceased. Then Curdy flew at the hole like a tiger and tore and pulled. The sides gave way, and it was soon large enough for him to crawl through. He would not betray himself by rekindling his lamp, but the torches of the retreating company, departing in a straight line up a long avenue from the door of their cave, threw back light enough to afford him a glance round the deserted home of the goblins. To his surprise, he could discover nothing to distinguish it from an ordinary cave in the rock, upon many of which he had come with the rest of the miners in the progress of their excavations. The goblins had talked of coming back for the rest of their household gear. He saw nothing that would have made him suspect a family had taken shelter there for a single night. The floor was rough and stony, the walls full of projecting corners, the roof in one place 20 feet high, in other endangering his forehead, while on one side a stream, no thicker than a needle, it is true, but still sufficient to spread a wide dampness over the wall, flowed down the face of the rock. But the troop in front of him was toiling under heavy burdens. He could distinguish Helfer now and then in the flickering light and shade, with his heavy chest on his bending shoulders, while the second brother was almost buried in what looked like a great feather bed. Where do they get the feathers? Thought Curdy, but in a moment the troop disappeared at a turn of the way, and it was now both safe and necessary for Curdy to follow them, lest they should be round the next turning before he saw them again, for so he might lose them altogether. He darted after them like a greyhound. When he reached the corner and looked cautiously round, he saw them again at some distance down another long passage. None of the galleries he saw that night bore signs of the work of man, or of goblin either. Stalactites far older than the mines hung from their roofs, and their floors were rough with boulders and large round stones, showing that there water must have once run. He waited again at this corner till they had disappeared round the next, and so followed them a long way through one passage after another. The passages grew more and more lofty, and were more and more covered in the roof with shining stalactites. It was a strange enough procession which he followed, but the strangest part of it was the household animals which crowded amongst the feet of the goblins. It was true they had no wild animals down there, at least they did not know of any, but they had a wonderful number of tame ones. I must, however, reserve any contributions toward the natural history of these for a later position in my story. At length, turning a corner too abruptly, he had almost rushed into the middle of the goblin family, for there they had already set down all their burdens on the floor of a cave considerably larger than that which they had left. They were as yet too breathless to speak, else he would have had warning of their arrest. He started back, however, before any one saw him, and retreating a good way, stood watching till the father should come out to go to the palace. Before very long, both he and his son, Helfer, appeared, and kept on in the same direction as before, while Curdy followed them again with renewed precaution. For a long time he heard no sound except something like the rush of a river inside the rock. But at length what seemed the far-off noise of a great shouting reached his ears, which, however, presently ceased. After advancing a good way farther, he thought he heard a single voice. It sounded clearer and clearer as he went on, until at last he could almost distinguish the words. In a moment or two, keeping after the goblins round another corner, he once more started back, this time in amazement. He was at the entrance of a magnificent cavern of an oval shape, once probably a huge natural reservoir of water, now the great palace hall of the goblins. It rose to a tremendous height, but the roof was composed of such shining materials, and the multitude of torches carried by the goblins, who crowded the floor, lighted up the place so brilliantly that Curdy could see to the top quite well. It's very bright. But he had no idea how immense the place was until his eyes had got accustomed to it, which was not for a good many minutes. The rough projections on the walls and the shadows thrown upward from them by the torches made the sides of the chamber look as if they were crowded with statues upon brackets and pedestals, reaching in irregular tiers from floor to roof. The walls themselves were, in many parts, of gloriously shining substances, some of them gorgeously colored, besides which powerfully contrasted with the shadows. Curdy could not help wondering whether his rhymes would be of any use against such a multitude of goblins as filled the floor of the hall, and indeed felt considerably tempted to begin his shout of 1, 2, 3, but as there was no reason for routing them, and much for endeavoring to discover their designs, he kept himself perfectly quiet, and, peeping round to the edge of the doorway, listened with both his sharp ears. At the other end of the hall, high above the heads of the multitude, was a terrace-like ledge of considerable height, caused by the receding of the upper part of the cavern wall. Upon this sat the king and his court. The king on a throne hollowed out of a huge block of green copper ore, and his court upon lower seats around it. The king had been making them a speech, and the applause which followed it was what Curdy had heard. One of the court was now addressing the multitude. What he heard him say was to the following effect.
Hence, it appears that two plans have been for some time together, working in the strong head of His Majesty for the deliverance of his people. Regardless of the fact that we were the first possessors of the region they now inhabit, regardless equally of the fact that we abandoned that region from the loftiest motives, regardless also of the self-evident fact that we excel them as far in mental ability as they excel us in stature. They look upon us as a degraded race and make a mockery of all our finer feelings. But the time has almost arrived when, thanks to His Majesty's inventive genius, it will be in our power to take a thorough revenge upon them once for all, in respect of their unfriendly behavior.
May it please your majesty,
Cried a voice close by the door which Curdy recognized as that of the goblin he had followed.
Who is he that interrupts the Chancellor?
Cried another from near the throne.
Glump!
Answered several voices.
He is our trusty subject.
Said the king himself in a slow and stately voice.
Let him come forward and speak.
A lane was parted through the crowd, and Glump, having ascended the platform and bowed to the king, spoke as follows.
Sire, I would have held my peace had I not known that I only knew how near was the moment to which the Chancellor had just referred. In all probability, before another day is passed, the enemy will have broken through into my house, the partition between being even now not more than a foot in thickness.
Not quite so much, thought Curdy to himself.
This very evening, I have had to remove my household effects. Therefore, the sooner we are ready to carry out the plan for the execution of which His Majesty has been making such magnificent preparations, the better. I may just add that within the last few days, I have perceived a small outbreak in my dining room, which combined with observations upon the course of the river, escaping where the evil men enter, has convinced me that close to the spot must lie a deep gulf in its channel. This discovery will, I trust, add considerably to the otherwise immense forces at His Majesty's disposal.
He ceased, and the king graciously acknowledged his speech with a bend of his head, whereupon Glump, after a bow to His Majesty, slid down amongst the rest of the undistinguished multitude. Then the Chancellor rose and resumed.
The information which the worthy Glump has given us,
he said,
might have been of considerable import at the present moment, but for that other design already referred to, which naturally takes precedence, His Majesty, unwilling to proceed to extremities, and well aware that such measures sooner or later result in violent reactions, has excogitated a more fundamental and comprehensive measure, of which I need say no more. Should His Majesty be successful, as who dares to doubt, then a peace all to the advantage of the Goblin Kingdom will be established for a generation at least, rendered absolutely secure by the pledge which His Royal Highness the Prince will have and hold for the good behavior of his relatives. Should His Majesty fail, which who shall dare even to imagine in his most secret thoughts, Then will be the time for carrying out which rigour the design to which Glump referred, and for which our preparations are even now all but completed. The failure of the former will render the latter imperative.
Curdie, perceiving that the assembly was drawing to a close, and that there was little chance of either plan being more fully discovered, now thought it prudent to make his escape before the goblins began to disperse, and slipped quietly away. There was not much danger of meeting any goblins, for all the men at least were left behind him in the palace, but there was considerable danger of his taking a wrong turning, for he had now no light, and had therefore to depend upon his memory and his hands. After he had left behind him the glow that issued from the door of Glump's new abode, he was utterly without guide, so far as his eyes were concerned. He was most anxious to get back through the hole before the goblins should return to fetch the remains of their furniture. It was not that he was in the least afraid of them, but as it was of the utmost importance that he should thoroughly discover what the plans they were cherishing were, he must not occasion the slightest suspicion that they were watched by a miner. He hurried on, feeling his way along the walls of rock. Had he not been very courageous, he must have been very anxious, for he could not but know that if he lost his way, it would be the most difficult thing in the world to find it again. Morning would bring no light into these regions, and toward him least of all, who was known as a special rhymester and persecutor, could goblins be expected to exercise courtesy? Well, might he wish that he had brought his lamp and tinder box with him, of which he had not thought when he crept so eagerly after the goblins. He wished it all the more when, after a while, he found his way blocked up and could get no further. It was of no use to turn back, for he had not the least idea where he had begun to go wrong. Mechanically, however, he felt himself about the walls that hemmed him in. His hand came upon a place where a tiny stream of water was running down the face of the rock.
What a stupid I am, he said to himself. I am actually at the end of my journey, and there the goblins, coming back to fetch their things,
he added, as the red glimmer of their torches appeared at the end of the long avenue that led up the cave. In a moment, he had thrown himself on the floor and wriggled backward through the hole. The floor on the other side was several feet lower, which made it easier to get back. It was all he could do to lift the largest stone he had taken out of the hole, but he did manage to shove it in again. He sat down on the ore heap and thought. He was pretty sure that the latter plan of the goblins was to inundate the mine, which just means overwhelm the mine, by breaking outlets for the water accumulated in the natural reservoirs of the mountain, as well as running through portions of it. All that means is he thinks that they're going to flood the mine with water. While the part hollowed by the miners remained shut off from that inhabited by the goblins, they had had no opportunity of injuring them thus. But now that the passage was broken through, and the goblins' part proved the higher in the mountain, it was clear to Curdie that the mine could be destroyed in an hour. Water was always the chief danger to which the miners were exposed. They met with a little choke damp sometimes, but never with the explosive fire damp so common in coal mines. Hence they were careful as soon as they saw any appearance of water. As the result of his reflections while the goblins were busy in their old home, it seemed to Curdie that it would be best to build up the whole of his gang, filling it with stone and clay or lime so that there would be no smallest channel for the water to get into. There was not, however, any immediate danger, for the execution of the goblins' plan was contingent upon the failure of that unknown design which was to take precedence of it. And he was most anxious to keep the door of communication open, that he might, if possible, discover what that former plan was. At the same time, they could not then resume their intermitted labors for the inundation without his finding it out, when by putting all hands to the work, the one existing outlet might in a single night be rendered impenetrable to any weight of water. For by filling the gang entirely up, their embankment would be buttressed by the sides of the mountain itself. As soon as he found that the goblins had again retired, he lighted his lamp and proceeded to fill the hole he had made with such stones as he could withdraw when he pleased. He then thought it better, as he might have occasion to be up a good many nights after this, to go home and have some sleep. How pleasant the night air felt upon the outside of the mountain after what he had gone through in the inside of it! He hurried up the hill without meeting a single goblin on the way, and called and tapped at the window until he woke his father, who soon rose and let him in. He told him the whole story, and, just as he had expected, his father thought it best to work that load no farther, but at the same time to pretend occasionally to be at work there still, in order that the goblins might have no suspicions. Both father and son then went to bed and slept soundly until the morning.
And that was Chapter 9, in the bag. By the way, Rolfe, thank you for helping me with some of those voices. I knew you could do some good goblins.
Oh, thank you. I could get really low. Well, I did this like that one. Did you like that one?
I did, Rolfe, but it was a little frightening to watch your tiny little body emit such a low, guttural noise. Well, thank you, Rolfe. We'll definitely be using you again.
Oh, yeah.
Rolfe, please stop talking like that. You need to use your normal voice. This is all audio-based, so the listeners at home need to know who they're listening to.
All right. I could go all the way back up. Okay. This is fine.
Thank you, Rolfe. Now, would you care to walk us through what happened?
Indeed. Little Curdy followed that goblin family all the way to the big hall of goblins where there were so many goblins. And there was one that was talking, and they were all planning what to do about the humans upstairs.
Yes, and when they say upstairs, all they mean is above the ground.
I know that.
I was just making it clear for everybody at home.
Don't stop interrupting me.
Okay, I'm sorry, Rolfe.
Thank you. So anyways, Curdy overheard some of the goblin plans, and he's gonna go back and talk to the mothers about it.
What exactly is Curdy afraid that the goblins will try to do?
Oh, he's afraid the goblins are gonna flood them.
Yes, that is what inundation means, my friends. I used it a couple times in this chapter, but all it means is they're gonna flood the place. Now, quite honestly, these goblins know some pretty large words.
Yes, they talked more smartly than the humans.
Well, now that Curdy is aware of what the goblins may be planning, I wonder what will happen next.
Me too! Let's read the next chapter.
No, Rolfe, it's way past your bedtime. This chapter's already went on too long. You need sleep.
No, I need goblins. I need to know.
No, Rolfe, you need sleep right now. I can see the big old bags forming underneath your eyeballs.
They're bags of story investment.
I don't even know what that means. All right, well, anyways, thank you, Camelmore peasants at home who are listening to Rolfe talk about his eyeball bags. I hope you all enjoyed tonight's chapters. The next chapters, the princess will come back to the story.
Oh, good, she's my favorite.
All right, good night, everybody.
Good night.
Go to bed, Rolfe.
Okay.